Give me a rifle, now. 32 SEALs were pinned in a kill box, 2 already dead. A shooter on the ridge 600 yards out, hidden in a shadowed crevice nobody could find. And the person asking for that rifle was the medic, 5'3", 26 years old. A civilian contractor everyone on that base had spent 3 days quietly underestimating. "You're a medic," Petty Officer Reese said. "I'm the only person on this ground who can make that shot before someone else bleeds out. So, hand me the rifle, or watch 3 more men go down while we argue about my job title." She breathed out halfway, stopped, squeezed. 600 yards away, the ridge went silent. And when the medics finally reached her hours later, the system flagged her identity as something impossible. Killed in action 2 years ago. This is the story of the woman the United States government erased, and the truth she came back to finish.
The cabin sat where the pines gave up and the granite took over, 6,000 feet above anything that mattered anymore. Wren Calloway split wood at dawn because her hands needed something to do before her mind caught up with her heart. Swing, crack, half a log falling clean on each side. 26 years old, small frame, 5'3", the kind of small that made men underestimate her before she ever opened her mouth, which was fine. She'd learned to prefer it that way. Because being underestimated meant being left alone, and being left alone meant nobody asked questions she'd spent 8 years refusing to answer. The axe came down again, perfect line, every single time. Her father taught her that. Not the wood splitting exactly, the precision underneath it, the idea that a body could be trained until it stopped making mistakes, until muscle memory replaced thought, until thought itself became the one thing standing between a person and the job in front of them. Gunnery Sergeant Emmett Calloway, Force Recon, 22 years of service, dead 8 years now. Training accident, the report said. She never believed the report. Not once, not for a single day of the 8 years since. The coffee went cold on the porch rail while she worked. She didn't notice. She rarely noticed anything anymore that didn't require her full attention, because giving anything less than full attention felt somehow like inviting disaster back into a life she'd built specifically to keep it out. The cabin itself had taken her 3 summers to finish properly. Hauled the lumber up the switchback herself, 1 truckload at a time, because paying someone else to do it meant a stranger learning the road, and a stranger learning the road meant one more person who could find her later if they ever came looking. She'd built the wood stove chimney with her own hands, badly at first, well enough by the 3rd try that it hadn't smoked her out of the place in 2 winters. She'd strung the fence line around the garden to keep the deer off the tomatoes, though the deer generally won that argument anyway. Small victories, small defeats. A life measured out in things she could control, because the one thing she couldn't control had already taken everything else from her once, and she didn't intend to hand it a second chance. Below the ridge line, a truck engine turned over on the gravel road. Wrong sound for this place. This mountain didn't get visitors. It got deer in the fall and snow in the winter, and twice a year, if she was unlucky, a hiker who took one look at the no trespassing sign nailed to a pine at the property line and reconsidered his whole life's decisions. She set the axe down, slow, deliberate, and listened. The engine climbed, downshifted hard at the switchback 3/4 of the way up, climbed again, laboring the way engines labored when the driver knew exactly how steep the grade got and pushed through it anyway, instead of easing off. Someone knew this road. Someone had been here before, more than once, because first-timers always overcorrected on that switchback and stalled halfway through it. Wren's hand found the doorframe without her eyes ever leaving the tree line. Inside, behind the loose floorboard beneath the kitchen table, sat a Sig Sauer P226 her father gave her on her 16th birthday. The serial number filed off in a way that would have gotten a lesser man arrested, and got her father nothing but a knowing look from the friend who did the filing for him. She didn't go for the gun yet. Not yet. Because instinct wasn't the same thing as danger. Instinct was just her body remembering things her mind had spent years trying to forget, and lately the two of them argued more than they agreed. The truck came around the final bend. Government plates, dust rising behind it, and a long gray plume that hung in the still mountain air, like something trying to spell out a warning nobody up here would bother reading. She knew the driver before he even stepped out. Knew him by the way he cut the engine a half-second too fast, like a man arriving somewhere he wasn't entirely sure he was welcome. Knew him by the stiffness in his shoulders when he finally opened the door. The particular stiffness of a body that had spent 30 years pretending high-altitude cold didn't bother it anymore. Master Sergeant Cole Ashford, her father's old spotter, the last man to see Emmett Calloway alive, and the first man Wren ever blamed for not being able to change that. Wren. Her name cracked in his mouth like it cost him something just to say it out loud. You drove 4 hours to say my name? I drove 4 hours because you don't answer your phone. That's because I don't own one. Ashford almost smiled at that, almost. The lines fanning out from his eyes didn't quite buy the performance, and neither did she. Can I come up? You're already up. She didn't move from the porch, didn't offer coffee, though the pot inside was still half full and still technically drinkable. Didn't offer anything at all because offering things implied this was a visit, and visits had endings, and Wren had learned a long time ago that people who showed up on her mountain unannounced never came bearing small reasons. Ashford climbed the steps anyway, the old wood groaning under his boots the same way it groaned under anyone's, and settled onto the porch rail across from her chair like he had some standing claim to the space. Maybe he did. He'd stood at her father's funeral in dress blues that didn't quite fit anymore. He'd carried the flag box when her mother's hands shook too hard to hold it, and he'd pressed it into Wren's arms afterward without a word because some things a person simply understood without needing to be told. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the silence stretched out over the clearing the way it always did up here, thick with pine sap and old grief, and the particular quiet of a place that had never once needed to be filled with noise to feel complete. A hawk turned slow circles above the tree line. Somewhere down the slope, water moved over rock in the little creek that fed her well, a sound so constant she'd stopped hearing it years ago except in moments exactly like this one, when everything else in her chest had gone loud enough that the world outside needed to compete for her attention. There's a training exercise, he said finally after the silence had stretched long enough that even he couldn't outwait it. Fort Ridgeline, combined operation, 32 SEALs running a live fire scenario alongside some new hardware a contractor's pushing through final testing. Not my problem. They need a medic. Then hire a medic. There are entire staffing agencies built around exactly that. I'm hiring you. Something tightened behind Wren's ribs, quick and hot, the particular reaction Ashford always managed to pull out of her whether he meant to or not, which annoyed her more than the request itself did, because it meant some part of her still responded to him the way she used to when she was young enough to think men in uniform could fix anything. I do triage at the clinic in Elkhorn now, she said. I stitch up loggers who catch their forearms on chainsaws and hunters who mistake themselves for deer. I don't do range work. Not anymore. You did more than range work once. That program doesn't exist, Cole. You know that. I know that. The whole world knows that because somebody made very sure of it 2 years ago. Silence again. The kind with real weight behind it. The kind that pressed down on a conversation until one person or the other finally gave. 2 years since Meridian pulled the funding, Ashford said. 2 years since the whole thing got buried in paperwork so deep even the people who buried it probably can't find it anymore. Buried you, technically, along with it. On record, you died in a training incident out in the Mojave. Real convenient timing considering what you'd found right before it happened. Her stomach dropped slow the way a stone drops through water that's gone still and cold. Don't, Wren. I said, don't. Because she'd spent 2 entire years training herself not to think about the folder. Not to think about the invoice numbers that never quite added up. The shell companies rotating through a supply chain that made no logistical sense unless someone was skimming from the top and needed the noise to hide it. Not to think about the fact that her father died 8 years ago chasing something that smelled, in hindsight, uncomfortably similar, and nobody in 8 years had bothered connecting those 2 dots. She'd convinced herself somewhere in there that leaving the dots unconnected was the only way she'd survive long enough to keep breathing. "This is a straight medic contract," Ashford said. 96 hours, in and out, paperwork clean, nobody looks at you twice. I need somebody I trust on that range, and there's nobody left in this world I trust more than you." "That's flattering." "It's the truth, and you know it." She looked past him down the long slope of the mountain toward the valley floor where the rest of the world kept turning without her in it, exactly the way she preferred things to run. "Why this exercise? Why now, after 2 years of you leaving me alone up here?" Ashford hesitated. That was the tell. 30 years in uniform had taught him to lie without so much as a flinch, so when he hesitated, it meant something real was sitting underneath whatever he said next. "Because Meridian Defense is running the hardware for this exercise," he said finally. "Same contractor name. Same name that showed up in your father's file 8 years ago. Same name, typed in the margin of the folder you found right before they shut the whole program down and made you disappear off the books." The wind picked up cold enough to cut through her flannel sleeve straight to the bone. She didn't feel it, because 8 years of careful, deliberate silence had just cracked open with one single sentence, and she didn't know yet whether that crack was an opportunity or a trap dressed up to look like one. "Cole." Her voice came out quieter than she meant it to. "You're asking me to walk back into the exact organization that buried my father and erased me. Why would I ever do that voluntarily?" "Because if you don't, nobody else on this earth is going to notice what I noticed when I read the exercise roster 3 days ago." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time since he'd climbed out of the truck, his composure slipped enough to show her the man underneath it. The one who'd carried a flag box because his hands were the only ones steady enough that day. "Meridian doesn't run field demonstrations for fun, Ren. They run them when they need cover for something. Your father figured that out once. It cost him everything. I'm not asking you to walk into a trap. I'm asking you to walk in with your eyes open, which is more than either of us managed the first time around." "I need an answer by tomorrow morning," Ashford said, pushing off the rail. "Truck leaves the staging point at 0500. He didn't wait around for her to walk him down. He knew better than that by now. He climbed back behind the wheel, started the engine, and paused, with one hand still in the open door. "Your father would have gone," he said. "You know that better than anyone." "My father's dead. That's exactly my point." The truck pulled away, dust rising behind it like smoke off a fire nobody remembered lighting. Ren stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded entirely into the tree line, swallowed up by pine and granite, and the particular silence of a mountain that had never once asked her for anything. She went inside once the quiet settled back over the clearing, knelt beside the kitchen table, pried up the loose floorboard with 2 fingers worn smooth from years of doing exactly that. The Sig Sauer sat exactly where she'd left it, oiled and ready, the way she kept every weapon in the cabin, whether she expected to need it or not. Beside it, folded into a square smaller than her palm, sat a photograph gone soft at the creases from handling. Her father, in his dress blues, 34 years old in the picture, younger than she was now somehow, even though he'd been 49 the year he died. It was strange, she thought, the way grief kept a person permanently younger than the one left behind to carry them. She hadn't looked at the photograph in months. She looked at it now, tracing the line of his jaw with one thumb, the same stubborn line she saw in the mirror every morning, whether she wanted to or not. Beneath the photograph, folded into the same hiding place, sat a second item she hadn't touched in even longer. A single dog tag, not her father's but her own, stamped with a name that didn't officially exist anymore. Ghost 6 had never been printed on anything issued to her. She'd had it made privately, off base, from a vendor who asked no questions and kept no records, because some part of her had wanted physical proof that the 2 years she'd spent inside that program actually happened, even after the Marine Corps quietly decided they hadn't. She held the tag in her palm for a long moment, then she put it back exactly where it had been, because looking at it too long always led somewhere she didn't have the strength to go alone. "Okay," she whispered. Whispering made the decision feel less like a choice and more like a confession, and right now, She needed it to feel like both. She spent the rest of the afternoon doing the things a person did before leaving a life they'd built to be quiet. Banked the fire so it wouldn't need tending for 4 days, left food out for the barn cat that had adopted her 2 winters ago, without asking permission, the way most good things in her life arrived uninvited and impossible to send away. Checked the oil in the truck she rarely drove, and the air in tires that had gone soft from disuse. Cleaned the Sig Sauer even though it didn't need cleaning, because her hands wanted the ritual of it, the particular calm that came from taking something apart and putting it back together in exactly the right order. She called her mother from the landline in town, the only phone she trusted with anything that mattered. "You're going," her mother said, not a question. 40 years of marriage to a Force Recon Marine had trained Eleanor Calloway to hear decisions before her daughter finished making them out loud. For 4 days. Medic contract, nothing more. With Cole Ashford. With Cole Ashford. A long pause on the line, the particular silence of a woman who'd buried a husband and spent 8 years watching her only daughter slowly disappear into a mountain rather than face the world that took him. "You know I never blamed Cole for what happened to your father," Eleanor said eventually. "But I never quite trusted him either, not the way your father did. There's a difference between a man who was there and a man who could have stopped it. I never figured out which one Cole actually was, and I don't think you have either." "He's the only lead I have, Mom." "I know, that's what worries me." "Be careful," Eleanor finally said. "And Wren, if you find anything at all about your father, you call me before you do a single thing about it. Promise me that much." "I promise." It was, she would later understand, the one promise of that entire week she wouldn't manage to keep. The memory came for her that night the way it always did. Uninvited, merciless, exact in every detail down to the smell of gun oil and desert dust. She was 18 again, standing at the edge of a range outside 29 Palms, watching her father load a rifle he'd built himself from parts most men would have called scrap and thrown away. He never explained anything twice. He believed a lesson taught twice was a lesson the student hadn't earned the right to learn the first time. "Breathe out halfway," he said, "then stop. The shot lives in the stillness after the exhale, not before it, not during it, after." She missed. Of course she missed. She was 18 and her hands still shook, and the desert heat came off the ground in waves that made the horizon look alive, like the whole world was breathing along with her and refusing to hold still. "Again," he said. She missed again. Again. On the 11th try, she hit dead center. Her father didn't smile. He never smiled at success. Only nodded, like success was simply the correction of a previous failure, and nothing more remarkable than that. A box checked, rather than a moment celebrated. "You have my eyes," he told her that day, and for years she thought he meant her vision, the sharp gray-blue color they shared. Later, much later, she understood he'd meant something else entirely. The way he saw the whole world in angles and distances and probabilities. The way nothing was ever simply a tree or simply a rock to him, but cover or exposure or a line of sight that could save a life or end one, depending on which side of it you stood. She remembered other things from that summer too, things the grief usually let her keep without twisting them into weapons against herself. The way he'd laughed, actually laughed, when she'd cursed at a stuck bolt on the rifle he'd built her, an honest, surprised sound she'd rarely heard from him off the range. The way he'd taught her to read wind, not from a chart but from the grass itself, the particular lean of a stem telling you more than any anemometer ever could. The way he'd told her once quietly over a fire that had burned down to embers that he hoped to God she never had to use any of what he was teaching her, and that he was teaching her anyway, because the world didn't much care what a father hoped for his daughter. 3 weeks after that lesson, he was dead. Training accident, they said. A misfire during a live drill, the kind of thing that happened to careless operators or unlucky ones. Except her father didn't misfire. Her father hadn't made a careless mistake with a weapon in 22 years of service, and the idea that he'd suddenly forgotten everything he'd ever taught anyone in the space of one ordinary afternoon never sat right with her. Not then. Not in the 8 years since. She'd asked to see the incident report. They gave her 3 redacted pages that told her a date, a location, and a signature she didn't recognize scrawled at the bottom, in handwriting too careless for something so final. She'd asked Ashford once, years ago, whether he believed the official story. He hadn't answered her. You'd only looked at her the way people look at something they're afraid to break, simply by handling it too roughly. And she'd let the silence stand, because pressing him further felt, at the time, like more than either of them could survive. She woke before sunrise with her heart racing and her sheets damp despite the mountain cold pressing in through the cabin's thin walls. Because the thing about grief, real grief, the kind that never fully resolves, no matter how many years pass, is that it doesn't fade so much as it goes quiet. It waits. And the moment someone hands you a thread that might lead back to the truth, it wakes up, all at once, hungry, as though it never slept a single night in all those years at all. She packed a bag before the sun cleared the ridge. Fort Ridgeline sat in a basin of cracked earth and heat-warped air 40 miles from the nearest town that could honestly call itself a town anymore. Chain-link fencing stretched for what looked like miles in every direction, topped with razor wire that caught the morning light and threw it back sharp like something trying to warn people off long before they got close enough to ask why. Wren rode in the passenger seat of Ashford's truck with her duffel wedged between her boots and her jaw set in a line that dared him to attempt small talk. He didn't try. 30 years of knowing her family had taught him that much, at least. Somewhere past the halfway mark, though, the silence finally cracked, not from him, but from her.
"Tell me something,"
she said, watching the scrub brush blur past the window.
"When you were his spotter, did he ever talk about walking away from it, from all of it?"
Ashford kept his eyes on the road a moment longer than the question required. Once, about a year before he died. Said something about wanting to teach you to fish properly instead of teaching you to put a round through a man's chest plate at 600 yards. I told him he was getting soft in his old age. He laughed it off, never brought it up again.
You think he meant it?
I think a man doesn't say something like that unless some part of him means it. I also think a man doesn't stop chasing the truth just because he's tired of carrying it. He glanced at her just briefly. You're a lot like him that way, if it helps to hear it.
It doesn't particularly.
Didn't figure it would. At the checkpoint, a young private, barely old enough to legally buy a beer, checked her contractor badge twice before waving them through, his eyes lingering on her a half-second longer than professional courtesy required. She was used to it by now. Small woman, medic badge, no visible rank because civilians didn't carry rank insignia. People made their assumptions fast and rarely bothered revising them. She let them because assumptions were armor if you knew how to wear them right. Inside the compound, the exercise staging area buzzed with the particular energy of men who already believed they knew exactly how the next 4 days would unfold. 32 SEALs. She counted them without meaning to, an old habit drilled so deep it had become involuntary. Always know your numbers. Always know your exits, your angles, your lines of retreat, even in places that were supposed to be safe. They moved through the staging area in loose clusters, checking gear, running comm checks, trading the particular dark-clipped humor that soldiers used, instead of admitting even to themselves that fear existed anywhere in the building. One of them noticed her first. Tall, built like a door frame, carrying the kind of easy confidence that came from a lifetime of never once being told no and believing it. "You're the medic?" he asked, the words themselves sounding like a joke he hadn't quite finished telling yet. "That's what the badge says." Huh. He looked her over, not unkindly, more like a man sizing up new equipment to see whether it would hold real weight under pressure. They usually send guys for this kind of thing. They usually don't have me available. A few of the men nearby laughed, not unkindly either, more at the shape of the exchange itself, the small, sharp-tongued woman standing her ground against a man built like a door frame. "Petty Officer Reese," he said, offering a hand. "You'll be running triage out of the forward staging tent for the duration."
Try to keep up. We move fast out here.
"I've kept up with faster." "Doubt it. Then you haven't met the right people yet." He grinned at that, a real grin, the kind that meant she'd earned something without particularly trying to. She didn't care either way. She hadn't come here to make friends. She'd come because a name buried in her father's old file had just resurfaced after 8 years of silence, and she intended to find out exactly why. "You got a first name, contractor?" Reese asked, still grinning as he walked her toward the tent line. "I've got one. You don't need it." "Fair enough. Ghost, then, if you're going to be mysterious about it." She didn't answer that, though. Something in her chest went very still for half a second, a name landing far closer to the truth than he could have possibly known. And she filed the coincidence away the same way she filed everything without deciding yet whether it mattered. Near the edge of the staging area, a smaller cluster of aircrew stood beside a matte gray helicopter running pre-flight checks with the same clipped efficiency as everyone else. A lean man in a flight suit caught her eye briefly across the yard, nodded once in the universal acknowledgement soldiers gave civilians they didn't yet have a reason to distrust, and went back to his checklist. Chief Warrant Officer Danny Pruitt, according to the name patch. She filed the face away the way she filed everything without deciding yet whether it mattered. The briefing tent smelled like canvas and diesel and too many bodies packed into not nearly enough shade. A colonel she didn't recognize stood at the front of the room, flanked by 2 men in civilian suits, far too clean for a place this dusty. "Meridian Defense representatives," Ashford murmured beside her, low enough that only she could hear it over the shuffle of boots and folding chairs. "The one on the left runs their government contracts division. Name's Grady Holt." Wren's eyes cut toward the man, mid-50s, silver at the temples, the posture of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where his word carried real weight. He smiled at the assembled SEALs like a man genuinely proud of something he'd built. "This exercise," Holt began, "represents a partnership between the Department of Defense and Meridian Defense Industries. What you'll be testing over the next 96 hours is a next-generation targeting system designed to reduce operator error in high-stress close-quarters engagements. Bureaucratic language, smooth and well-rehearsed. The kind of language that told a room nothing at all while sounding on the surface like it told the room everything. Wren studied the folder resting on the table in front of Holt, upside down from where she sat the letters backward and cramped. She'd read upside-down documents her whole childhood sitting across from her father at the kitchen table while he pored over maps and requisition manifests long after she was supposed to be asleep. Meridian Defense Project, Crosshair. Her stomach turned to stone, slow and complete, like water freezing from the surface down. Because that name, Crosshair, that exact name had been typed in the margin of a document she'd found 2 years ago buried inside a supply requisition file she was never supposed to have access to, right before the entire program that trained her vanished overnight, as though it had never existed at all. She didn't move, didn't let her face betray a single flicker of what was happening behind it. 8 years of discipline held her perfectly still while her mind raced through everything at once, sorting and resorting the pieces into a shape she didn't want to see but couldn't stop assembling. Which meant this couldn't be a coincidence. Except nothing about Ashford's sudden appearance at her cabin had ever felt like coincidence. Not really. Not if she allowed herself to be honest about it. So the only real question left was whether he'd known that when he asked her to come. The forward staging tent became her entire world for the next 2 days. She learned the rhythm of the exercise fast, the way she learned everything fast when her focus had somewhere useful to go. Wake before the SEALs did, set up the triage station with the particular obsessive order her father used to bring to his own gear, trauma shears here, tourniquets there, everything within arm's reach without needing to look. Watch 32 men run drills that looked to an untrained eye like violence rehearsed until it became something close to art. She was good at her job, better than good. She'd stitched wounds in conditions far worse than this one back when her cover required her to be exactly what she pretended to be now, a contract medic, who happened to know considerably more about trauma than most surgeons twice her age. On the first afternoon, a young operator named Delgado sliced his palm open on a jagged edge of a breaching tool, and by the time he made it to her tent, he'd already convinced himself he needed stitches from a real hospital. Wren had him numbed, cleaned, and closed in 11 minutes flat, her hands moving with a steadiness that made the man's swagger falter halfway through.
"You sew like you've done this before," Delgado said, watching her tie off the last suture. "I have." "Where?" "Around."
He didn't push further, mostly because Reese appeared in the tent doorway at that exact moment, arms crossed, watching the whole exchange with an expression Wren couldn't quite place yet. Reese became something like a friend in the loose, testing way soldiers build friendships, needling each other with jokes that were really questions, wearing a disguise. "You ever serve?" he asked on the second evening settled onto an overturned crate outside the tent, while the desert cooled from furnace to freezer in the space of a single hour. "Contractor," she said. "That's all you need to know." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting." He studied her a long moment, head tilted slightly the way a man studies a puzzle he suspects is missing at least one obvious piece.
"You move like someone who's been in a fight before. Not a bar fight. The other kind. Everybody's been in a fight. Not like that." She didn't answer, because answering meant lying, and she was tired, bone tired of the particular exhaustion that came from lying to people who were slowly starting to earn better than that from her. Instead, she asked a question of her own. "You trust the Meridian reps?" Reese's expression shifted just slightly, a shadow crossing behind his eyes before he could smooth it back into something neutral. "Above my pay grade to trust or not trust them. They write the checks that keep this whole exercise funded." "That's not what I asked." "No." He glanced toward the command tent where lights still burned behind canvas walls despite the late hour. "It's not." Which told her everything she needed to know and simultaneously nothing at all. "You got people waiting on you back home?" Reese asked after a while, the question arriving sideways, the way soldiers asked the things that actually mattered to them. "My mother. A barn cat with better manners than most men I've met. That's it. That's plenty. No husband, no kids. No husband, no kids, no apologies for either." She glanced sideways at him. "You writing my biography, petty officer? Just making conversation. Try harder next time." He laughed at that, low and easy, and for a moment the compound felt almost like an ordinary place, two people passing an evening the way people did anywhere before either of them remembered what tomorrow actually held. On the third night, sleep refused her the way it always did in places like this. Too many bodies and too little privacy. The constant low hum of generators running somewhere beyond the tree line like an insect that never tired. She walked the perimeter alone, against protocol technically, though nobody stopped a medic from taking a walk, and she needed the movement the way other people needed air in their lungs. The command tent glowed faint gold against the dark. She shouldn't have stopped there. She told herself that even as her boots slowed, even as she settled into the shadow thrown by a supply crate and let two voices carry through the thin canvas wall toward her. "Can't run the live fire phase with civilian oversight present," one voice said. Holt's, smooth, even, wrapped in irritation. "The medic's cleared," a second voice answered, older, rougher, a voice that carried command the way some men carried scars, visibly, permanently, without ever explaining how they got there. "Ashford vouched for her, personally." "Ashford vouches for a lot of people, doesn't mean I like it." "You don't have to like it, Colonel, you have to let the exercise run on schedule." Corporate's already 3 weeks behind on the demonstration timeline, and every day past that costs money neither of us wants to explain losing. A pause long enough that Wren's pulse ticked upward in the silence, stretching around it. "And if something goes wrong?" the colonel asked. "Nothing's going to go wrong," Holt said. "We control every variable in this exercise." "Every single one." Something in his voice, a certainty, pitched too smooth, too rehearsed, the particular tone of a man reciting a line he'd said 100 times before and believed a little less each time the words left his mouth. Wren backed away from the tent, slow, careful, placing each boot the way her father taught her, like the ground itself might betray her the instant she stopped paying it proper respect. Because her father used to say that the most dangerous words in any operation weren't threats. They were reassurances.
Men who told you nothing could possibly go wrong were without fail the same men already quietly planning for exactly the moment when it did. She made it back to the medic tent without being seen, sat on the edge of her cot in the dark, knees drawn to her chest, and let herself think for the first time in 2 full years that maybe the folder she'd found back then wasn't the end of her father's story after all. Maybe it had only ever been the beginning. Somewhere past the fence line, a coyote called into the dark, and something in that lonely, unanswered sound settled into her chest like a promise she hadn't quite meant to make out loud. Tomorrow, the live fire phase would begin. Tomorrow, 32 SEALs would run a scenario controlled, at least on paper, by a company that had buried her father's death 8 years ago and erased her own existence from the record 2 years after that. She closed her eyes, breathed out halfway, stopped. The shot lives in the stillness after the exhale, her father's voice whispered from somewhere she'd long since stopped being able to reach him, except in moments precisely like this one, when the silence around her finally grew still enough to let him back in. Not before it, not during it, after. She dreamed in the last hour before her watch alarm finally dragged her upright of the program itself, the way she sometimes did when her guard was down enough to let it surface. 2 years of her life had happened inside a facility with no name painted on any building, in a valley so remote the nearest civilian road sat 40 minutes away by truck. 6 women total at the program's peak, drawn from every branch, every background, united only by a particular combination of small stature, sharp eyes, and a willingness to disappear into a role nobody expected a woman to fill. The instructors called it economy of force. Fewer resources spent proving a threat existed where nobody thought to look for one. She remembered the first week when a training cadre officer named Voss had looked her up and down in a hallway and told her flatly that she'd wash out within a month. She remembered the particular satisfaction of standing in the same hallway 11 weeks later while Voss reviewed her scores and said nothing at all because there was nothing left to say. She remembered the day the program ended, too, though that memory came with sharper edges, less nostalgia, and more the particular vertigo of watching a life get folded up and put away without her consent. A directive, unsigned by anyone willing to attach their name to it, citing budget realignment and program consolidation, words designed to mean nothing to anyone who might ask follow-up questions. Her handler, a quiet man named Osei, who'd trained her in exactly the kind of long-range work her father once practiced, had pulled her aside the final morning and told her in a voice she'd never forget that whatever she did next, she should do it somewhere Meridian Defense couldn't find her. She hadn't asked him what he meant by that. She understood now, lying awake in a medic tent at Fort Ridgeline 8 years and 2 lifetimes later, exactly what he'd meant. Her alarm went off at 0500, insistent and mechanical, and she was already awake to receive it. The compound moved differently in the dark before dawn, quieter, more deliberate. The particular hush of 32 men conserving energy for a day they all sensed on some animal level was going to demand more of them than the schedule promised. Wren dressed in the same practical layers she always wore, boots laced tight, medical kit checked twice out of habit rather than necessity. Ashford found her outside the staging tent, 2 cups of black coffee in hand, offering one without a word. She took it without comment because some gestures didn't need commentary attached to them. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you." "Fair." He drank from his own cup, eyes on the horizon, where the first hint of gray was just beginning to bleed into the black. "You heard something last night. I could see it on you at breakfast." "I heard Holt talking like a man who already knows how this exercise ends." Ashford's jaw tightened just slightly, the particular tension of a man filing away information he didn't yet know what to do with. "You think something's wrong with the scenario. I think your instincts brought me out here for a reason. Cole and I don't think either of us has figured out the whole reason yet." "Maybe not." He looked at her, something almost apologetic in his expression. "For what it's worth, I wasn't lying about needing someone I trust on that range. I just didn't know yet how much I'd end up needing you for." "That's not exactly comforting." "Wasn't meant to be.
just honest. She let that sit between them a moment, the coffee warm in her hands, the compound slowly stirring to life around them in the gray pre-dawn light. "If this goes sideways," she said finally, "I need you to promise me something."
Name it. If it comes down to protecting Meridian's reputation or telling the truth about what happened to my father, you pick the truth, every time, no matter what it costs either of us.
Ashford held her gaze a long moment, and something old and tired passed behind his eyes, the particular weight of a promise he suspected might cost him more than he was prepared to admit out loud.
I already made that choice 8 years ago, he said quietly. I just didn't have the courage to act on it until you walked back through that door.
Neither of them said anything else. There wasn't anything else that needed saying. The compound around them kept moving gear, being checked engines turning, over 32 men preparing for a scenario that existed on paper, purely to test a piece of hardware nobody in that tent yet understood had already been weaponized against them.
The sky over the ridgeline had turned the color of a fresh bruise by the time the convoy finally rolled out, purple bleeding slowly into orange. Beautiful, in the specific, indifferent way deserts always manage to be beautiful right before something terrible happened inside them.
Wren climbed into the second Humvee beside the crates of medical gear, checked the strap on her kit one final time, out of habit, and let her eyes close for exactly 3 seconds. No more, no less. The way she'd trained herself to steal calm in small, deliberate doses, whenever the world demanded she stay sharp for longer than any body was reasonably built to manage. Somewhere ahead of the convoy, the mock compound waited, under a sky that hadn't yet decided what kind of day it intended to be. Somewhere behind her, a mountain cabin sat quiet and cold, a fire banked low, a barn cat curled by an empty porch chair, waiting for a woman who had no idea yet how long it would actually be before she made it home again.
She opened her eyes as the engine turned over beneath her, and whatever came next, she told herself she would meet it the same way her father taught her to meet everything that mattered. Breathe out halfway, then stop. The shot, whatever shape it eventually took, would live in the stillness after. It always had. It always would, no matter how many years passed between one exhale and the next. The live fire phase began at 0600 with a sky the color of a bruised purple, bleeding into orange along the ridgeline like something wounded, trying to heal too fast to do it properly. Wren stood at the edge of the staging area and watched 32 SEALs move into formation. Full gear now, live rounds. The exercise scenario called for a simulated compound clearance 2 clicks north, some fabricated hostage situation dreamed up by an analyst who'd never once smelled cordite in his life and wouldn't recognize real fear if it introduced itself by name. Except nothing about the tightness building in her chest this morning felt simulated. Because she'd learned a long time ago to trust the feeling before she trusted the reasoning behind it. Her father called it the itch. The thing that crawled up your spine a full step ahead of whatever your brain managed to catch up with later. The itch was screaming at her this morning, and it hadn't stopped since she woke. "You're quiet?"
Reese said, falling into step beside her as the convoy loaded gear into the waiting vehicles. "I'm always quiet. Quieter than usual. Maybe I don't like getting up before the sun does." He didn't buy it. She could tell by the way his eyes lingered a half-second longer than the joke deserved, the way soldiers learned to read faces the same way they read terrain, scanning for anything that didn't sit quite right.
But he let it go, because the job was starting, and the job came first.
She rode in the second Humvee with the medical gear rattling in crates behind her seat. Ashford drove. Neither of them spoke for the first 10 minutes, the silence between them thick enough to choke on if either had tried. "You heard something," he finally said.
Not a question.
"I heard Holt and the colonel arguing 2 nights ago outside the command tent." Ashford's hands tightened on the wheel just slightly, just enough for her to notice. "About what?" "About control, about variables, about how nothing was going to go wrong." She watched the desert scroll past the window, cracked earth and scrub brush and heat already rising off the ground in visible waves that made the horizon shimmer like something alive.
People who say that with that much confidence are usually the people already planning for what happens when it does.
That's your father talking. My father was right about a lot of things, Cole. That's kind of the problem I've spent 8 years living with. Ashford exhaled through his nose and didn't argue, which told her more than an argument would have managed. The convoy reached the staging point 40 minutes later, a cluster of abandoned structures built for exactly this purpose, mock windows and mock doors and walls thin enough to simulate breach points without actually costing the army real money to rebuild after every drill season. Except something about the layout was wrong. Wren noticed it before anyone said a word out loud. Extra vehicles parked along the tree line that hadn't appeared anywhere in the briefing materials. 2 of them, unmarked, both facing outward toward the exit road instead of inward toward the compound the way support vehicles were supposed to sit. Vehicles positioned to leave in a hurry weren't support vehicles. They were extraction. Ashford, her voice dropped low, urgent. Look at the tree line. Those 2 trucks. He looked. Whatever he saw made his whole posture change. Those aren't ours. No, she said. They're not. The SEALs moved into position around the mock compound, communicating through hand signals and the clipped shorthand of men who'd rehearsed this exact choreography 1,000 times before. Reese led the first squad toward the northern entry point, confident, fast exactly the way years of training had shaped him to be. Exactly the way an ambush would want him to be if someone on the other end had studied his file closely enough. The first shot came from the ridge above the compound instead of from inside it, and it wasn't a training round. Wren knew the difference in her bones before her mind fully processed the sound. Training rounds cracked flat and hollow, engineered to simulate danger without ever truly threatening anyone behind the simulation. This shot carried weight, depth, the unmistakable low note of a live round tearing through real air toward a real target that had no idea yet how real the morning had just become. A SEAL near the northern wall went down hard, clutching his shoulder, blood already spreading dark and fast through his uniform. Chaos erupted in the space of a single breath. "Contact! Contact! Contact!" Someone screamed, and the words rippled outward through 32 men who'd trained their entire adult lives for exactly this moment and never once not really expected it to arrive. Wren's training kicked in half a step ahead of her fear. She grabbed the medical kit and moved low and fast toward the fallen SEAL, because that was her job, had always been her job, even back when the job used to mean something else entirely. "Ashford, get them into cover," she shouted, sliding into the dirt beside the wounded man. 23 years old, name patch read Morales, blood pumping from a wound just below the collarbone, dangerously close to the subclavian artery for anyone's comfort. "Stay with me," she said, pressing gauze hard against the wound. "Look at me. Not the sky. Me." "Am I gonna die?" "Not on my watch." Which was a promise she had no real authority to make, except she made it anyway, because sometimes a lie was the only thing capable of keeping a man's heart beating at the rate his body needed it to. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions now, not the disciplined bursts of trained operators, but the scattered chaos of an ambush executed by people who'd studied the exercise schedule closely and knew exactly where 32 SEALs would be standing at exactly this moment. Which meant someone had handed them that schedule. Which meant someone inside Fort Ridgeline had sold 32 lives to whoever was firing down from that ridge. Wren packed the wound tight, tied it off, screamed for 2 nearby operators to help carry Morales toward cover. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook anymore. Not since the program, not since 8 years of training had rebuilt her from the ground up into someone who functioned cleanly in exactly this kind of moment, whatever it cost her afterward. Except the moment kept getting worse. A second SEAL went down, then a third. The compound built to simulate a hostage rescue had become a genuine kill box, and the men trapped inside were running out of cover faster than the math allowed for. A fourth man, young, barely out of buds by the look of him, froze against the compound's southern wall, his rifle raised but his hands trembling too badly to fire it. Wren caught the moment out of the corner of her eye while she worked, the particular stillness of a body caught between training and terror, and something in her chest recognized it immediately, because she'd frozen exactly like that once too, a lifetime ago, before her father taught her that fear itself wasn't the enemy, only the hesitation it produced.
Ferris!
Reese's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and immediate. Eyes on me. Breathe. You know this. You've run this 100 times. The young operator's hands steadied marginally enough to bring his weapon back level, and Wren filed away almost without meaning to, the particular way Reese commanded without ever raising his voice into something cruel, the particular difference between a leader who built confidence and one who simply demanded it. Reese found her crouched behind a supply crate, blood on her hands that wasn't hers, eyes scanning the ridge with an intensity that didn't match her cover story in the slightest. "We need eyes on that shooter," he said, breathing hard. "Whoever's up there has the whole compound zeroed, and we've got no clean angle back." "I know." "You know." I can read the muzzle flash pattern. Bolt action, suppressed but not silent. Whoever's up there is good, really good. Reese stared at her a beat too long, something shifting behind his eyes. "How do you know that?" She didn't answer, because answering meant unraveling 8 careful years of silence in the middle of an active firefight, and some doors once opened refused to close again, no matter how badly you needed them to. "Reyes is pinned!" someone shouted from the western wall. "No eyes on the shooter, no clean line. We're gonna lose more people if we don't get counterfire up there fast!" Wren looked toward the ridge, 600 yards, maybe 620, elevation change of roughly 40 feet, wind out of the northwest at maybe 8 or 9 miles an hour, enough to matter at that range without making the shot impossible. She'd made harder shots than that. She'd made that exact shot, at that exact range more times than she could count anymore, back when the program still existed, back when the world still had a use for whatever her father had spent her childhood building inside her. "Give me a rifle," she said. Reese blinked. "What?" "A rifle. Now." "Doesn't matter what. Just give me something with reach before someone else bleeds out down here." "You're a medic." "I'm the only person on this ground who can make that shot before someone dies waiting for a better option. So hand me the rifle or watch 3 more men go down while we argue about my job title." Something in her voice, a certainty that had no business belonging to a contract medic. A certainty that belonged instead to someone who'd spent her whole life being told that exact kind of certainty was the only thing standing between a mission's success and its failure. Reese hesitated half a second. Then he pulled the rifle off his own back and pressed it into her hands. It wasn't her father's rifle. Wasn't even close. But her hands recognized the shape of a weapon the way other hands recognized a steering wheel. Instinctive, immediate. A language she'd never fully stopped speaking, even through the years she'd pretended not to know a single word of it. She moved to the edge of the supply crate, settled into position, elbows locked, breathing already slowing into the rhythm her father had drilled into her before she was old enough to legally drive a car. "Ghost 6 copies," she murmured, quiet enough that only she could hear it. The old call sign rising out of her mouth like the ghost of something she'd buried 2 years ago and never properly mourned. "Ghost 6 is up." Through the scope, the ridge sharpened into focus. Rock formation, scrub brush, and there, tucked into a shadowed crevice most eyes would have scanned straight past without a second glance, the faint heat shimmer distortion of a suppressed muzzle. She breathed out halfway, stopped, squeezed. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, and 600 yards away, the shadow in the crevice went still, in a way shadows never went still on their own. The ridge fell silent. For 3 full seconds, the entire compound held its breath together. 31 remaining SEALs and 1 exposed medic, all waiting to learn whether that silence meant victory or only a pause before something worse came down on top of them. Then Reese's radio crackled. "Shoot her down. Repeat, shoot her down. Ridge is clear." Relief broke through the nearest men in ragged cheers, raw and immediate, the sound of soldiers who'd braced to lose more brothers today than they actually had. Reese turned to look at her properly for the first time, the way a person looks at something after realizing they'd had it wrong from the very beginning. "Who are you?" She lowered the rifle. Her hands finally shook just slightly, the adrenaline finally loosening its grip enough to let the tremor through. "I told you," she said. "I'm the medic." "Medics don't make 600-yard shots with somebody else's rifle. This one does." He opened his mouth to press further, but Ashford's voice cut through the radio chatter before he could get another word out.
All units converge on the command position. Secondary threat reported near the eastern perimeter. Repeat, secondary threat, eastern perimeter. The relief died as fast as it had arrived.
Because one shooter on a ridge wasn't an ambush by itself. One shooter was a distraction. And distractions existed for exactly one reason: to pull every available set of eyes away from something worse unfolding somewhere else entirely. In the 20 minutes it took the compound to stabilize enough for anyone to think clearly, Wren moved between the wounded with the particular efficiency of someone who'd trained her whole adult life for exactly this kind of morning.
Morales stable now, color returning slowly to his face as the shock wore thin. A second SEAL with a graze along his ribs that looked worse than it was. A third, older, quieter, who'd taken a round through the meat of his thigh and would need evacuation. The compound currently had no working way to provide. "You did good work out there," she told him, tying off the pressure bandage with hands that had gone steady again now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Femoral's intact. You'll walk again without a limp if you stop trying to be a hero for the next 6 weeks. "Wasn't trying to be a hero," the man said through gritted teeth. "Was trying not to die." "Smartest thing anyone's said to me all morning." He managed something close to a laugh, thin and pained, and she moved on to the next man before the moment could stretch any longer than either of them needed it to. Reese found her between patients, crouched beside a supply crate, watching her hands work with an intensity that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the question he hadn't stopped turning over since the ridge went quiet. "That shot," he said, low enough that only she could hear it over the ambient chaos. 600 yards, moving target suppressed, shooter in a shadowed crevice. Most trained snipers would have needed a spotter to even locate. You did that with someone else's rifle, cold, no zero, no time to dial anything in. I got lucky. Nobody gets that lucky. Then I suppose I'm the exception. He studied her a long moment, something working behind his eyes that looked less like suspicion now and more like a man recalculating the shape of a person he'd already decided he respected, regardless of what she turned out to actually be. "Whoever you really are," he said finally, "I'm glad you were standing on that crate today. Don't get sentimental on me, petty officer. We've still got a compound full of wounded men and a security breach nobody's explained yet." "Copy that." He straightened, some of the old, easy confidence returning to his posture, even as his eyes stayed sharp, alert, scanning the tree line out of habit now, rather than instruction. "But for what it's worth, I don't think you're just a contractor, and I don't think that's a bad thing." She didn't answer. There wasn't an answer yet that wouldn't cost her more than she was ready to pay in the middle of an active crime scene, and some conversations she'd learned were better left unfinished until the ground beneath them stopped shifting entirely. They found the eastern perimeter breached 20 minutes later. A section of fencing cut clean through the kind of precise work that required both proper tools and enough time to use them, along with detailed knowledge of exactly where the camera blind spots sat along that stretch of wire. Someone had walked through that fence hours before the exercise had even officially started. Someone who knew the schedule down to the minute. Wren followed Ashford and a 6-man SEAL element toward the supply depot near the eastern wall where the exercise's classified hardware, the Meridian prototype targeting systems everyone had gathered here to test, had been stored under guard through the night. The guard lay unconscious near the depot entrance, zip-tied at the wrists. Alive, thank God, but out cold from a blow that had split skin open above his eyebrow. The depot itself sat wide open, empty crates where the prototype cases should have been stacked. "They took the hardware," Reese said, disbelief cutting hard through the words. "In the middle of a live exercise with 32 SEALs on site, somebody just walked in and took it." "Not somebody," Wren said. Her eyes had already moved to the guard's restraints, studying the specific knot pattern used, the kind of knot no random contractor or opportunistic thief would ever think to tie. "Someone who trained the exact same way we did." Meaning whoever pulled this off wasn't some outside threat working blind. This was inside knowledge. Guard rotations, camera blind spots, exercise timing down to the minute. She stood, wiping her palms against her thighs, her mind racing faster than she wanted it to.
This was built by someone who had access to absolutely everything. She knelt beside the unconscious guard again, checking his pulse, his pupils, the particular quality of unconsciousness rather than something worse.
He'll live. Whoever hit him wanted him alive. That's a choice, not an accident. Somebody didn't want a body on their hands, they'd have to explain. Or somebody didn't consider one army guard worth the paperwork, Ashford said grimly. Either way, that's cold calculation, not panic. Nobody panicking cuts a fence this clean or ties a knot this deliberate. Ashford's radio crackled again. This time it was the colonel's voice, pulled tight with barely controlled fury. All personnel, report to command immediately. We have a security breach and I want answers before I want excuses. The walk back to command felt longer than it should have. 32 exhausted, bloodied SEALs and one exposed medic moving through a compound that no longer resembled a training ground in the slightest.
It resembled a crime scene.
Because that's exactly what it had become. Inside the command tent, Holt stood near the main table, his composure cracked for the first time since Wren had arrived at Fort Ridgeline. Sweat darkened the collar of his once-pressed shirt. His hands, whenever he gestured, weren't quite steady anymore. "This is a catastrophic failure," he said, more to himself than to the room at large. 2 years of development, gone in a single morning. 2 men are dead, the colonel snapped. 1 shooter neutralized by your civilian medic who somehow put a round through a suppressed target at 600 yards, an event I intend to have explained to me in exhaustive detail, and you're standing here worried about hardware. The hardware represents a national security risk if it falls into the wrong hands, Colonel. So does an ambush executed inside a secure military installation. Wren stood near the back of the tent watching the exchange with the particular stillness she'd learned from years of listening more than speaking. Something about Holt's reaction didn't quite fit together. His fear looked genuine enough, but fear over lost hardware felt different somehow from fear over an entire security failure. And the longer she watched him, the more clearly she understood which one she was actually seeing play out across his face. He wasn't afraid the mission had failed. He was afraid something had gone sideways with a plan he'd already known about long before this morning. "I need to see the guard rotation logs," she said, stepping forward before she'd fully decided to speak at all, "and the camera footage from the eastern perimeter going back at least 72 hours. Every head in the tent turned toward her. "Excuse me," Holt said. "The knots used to restrain the guard, that's specialized training, not improvisation. Whoever did this had access to the base's full security protocols. I want to know exactly who had that access." "You're a contract medic," Holt said, something sharper entering his voice now. "This is well beyond your clearance. 90 minutes ago, I was beyond my job description too, and it saved a man's life on that ridge." She held his gaze steady, unblinking the way her father had taught her to hold a target in the scope, no matter how badly her own pulse wanted to jump. "So, either give me the logs or explain to the colonel why a Meridian representative doesn't want a security review after 2 years of development, just walked straight out the front gate." The tent went silent. Ashford stepped in before Holt could answer, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd earned it the hard way over 3 decades. "She's cleared, Colonel. I'm personally vouching for her. If she's asking for those logs, there's a reason behind it." The colonel studied Wren for a long moment. Whatever he saw settled something in him because he turned to the young corporal manning the security terminal and gave a single sharp nod.
"Pull the logs, all of them."
She found it 40 minutes later, alone in the security tent, scrolling through camera timestamps, while Ashford stood guard at the entrance flap, ostensibly for privacy, actually because he trusted no one else on this base to watch her back right now. The eastern perimeter camera cut out at 0347, not damaged, not malfunctioning. Manually disabled, the log showed clearly, using an access code issued to base security personnel with proper clearance. She traced the access code back through the personnel database, her fingers moving faster than her breathing could quite keep pace with, and felt the floor tilt beneath her, even though she hadn't moved so much as an inch. Master Sergeant Grady Holt's clearance code. Not the civilian Meridian representative sitting in the meeting she'd just left. A different Holt entirely, she realized, cross-referencing the personnel files with fingers that had gone cold despite the tense, stifling midday heat. Master Sergeant Grady Holt, Base Security Liaison. No listed relation on paper to the civilian Holt from Meridian, except the shared surname, sat there on the screen, glowing back at her like something far too coincidental to actually be coincidence.
Which meant either two men named Holt existed on this base by sheer chance, or one man had built himself two separate identities, one civilian, one military, each providing cover and access the other could never achieve on its own. She pulled up the base's full personnel roster with hands that had gone entirely cold. One entry. One single record. Master Sergeant Grady Holt transferred to Fort Ridgeline 8 years ago. 8 years. The same year her father died. Her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs and refused for a long moment to move at all. Because 8 years ago, Grady Holt had arrived at whatever base her father served on before his death, and now, 8 years later, a man carrying the exact same rare surname sat in a briefing tent representing the exact defense contractor connected to a project called Crosshair, the same name, buried in the file that had gotten her entire program erased 2 years ago. She pulled the archived incident report next, the one from 8 years ago, the one the Marine Corps had handed her mother 3 redacted pages and a signature she'd never once been able to place. She placed it now. G. Holt. The same signature, the same careless slant on the capital H. 8 years apart, and the handwriting hadn't changed at all. "Oh, God," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them from leaving her mouth. Ashford's head turned from the entrance. What? She didn't answer right away. Couldn't. Her mind was racing backward through 8 years of grief, reorganizing every single memory of her father's death around a name she'd never once suspected. Because why would she have? Because Grady Holt had shaken her hand in the briefing tent 3 days ago and smiled at her like a man with absolutely nothing to hide. "The report," she finally managed. "My father's death report. It's signed by Holt." Ashford crossed the tent in 3 long strides, staring at the screen over her shoulder, his face drained of color at the exact same speed hers had. "That's impossible," he said. "Holt wasn't stationed anywhere near your father's unit 8 years ago. I'd have known." According to the official record, no. According to the personnel database, he transferred to a classified detachment the same month, same base, same operational window as the incident that killed my father. Her voice shook now. The professional calm she'd built brick by brick over 8 years, cracking apart in real time under the weight of it. "He was there, Cole. He was right there, and somebody buried it deep enough that I never once thought to look because nobody ever gave me a single reason to." The tent flap rustled behind them both. Wren turned, instinct sharpening every muscle in her body a full second before her mind caught up with the movement, and found herself staring directly into the eyes of Grady Holt himself, standing, framed in the entrance, watching the two of them with an expression she knew she'd never forget for the rest of her life. Because it wasn't surprise written across his face. It was recognition. "Ms. Calloway," he said, and the way he said her real name, her actual name, a name she hadn't used once on this base during her entire contract, told her everything she needed to know before he spoke another word. "You know exactly who I am. I've known since the moment you walked through that gate 3 days ago." He stepped fully into the tent, unhurried, carrying the calm of a man who'd already calculated every possible outcome of this exact conversation days in advance. "I've known since Meridian flagged your medical contractor application against a facial recognition database that was never supposed to exist outside classified channels in the first place." Ashford's hand drifted toward the sidearm at his hip. Holt noticed immediately. Didn't so much as flinch. "I wouldn't," Holt said mildly. "Not because I'd stop you personally, Sergeant, because there are eyes on this tent right now that would make certain neither of you walked out of it afterward." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees without a single window ever opening. "You killed my father," Wren said. Flat. Quiet.
The particular quiet that arrives right before something breaks completely and finally.
Your father found something he shouldn't have, Holt said. Financial irregularities buried in a program that predates Crosshair by nearly a decade. He was preparing to report it up the chain. I gave him every opportunity in the world to walk away first. He didn't take it.
No. Something flickered across Holt's face. Not quite guilt, exactly. Something colder, more clinical. The particular emptiness of a man who'd made peace with an unforgivable choice a very long time ago and never once looked back at it since. Your father was a great many things, Miss Calloway. Reasonable wasn't always one of them. Wren's hands curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her own palms.
And my program, she said. You erased it. Because I found the same file he did all those years later. You found a fragment? Holt corrected, almost gently. Which was more than enough to require a response. Shutting the program down quietly was cleaner than the alternative, Miss Calloway. You should be grateful for that particular distinction, honestly. Grateful? You're alive. Your father wasn't afforded that same courtesy, and neither will the 2 SEALs who died on that ridge this morning if this conversation continues in a direction I find unproductive to my current situation. Ashford's voice cut through the tent, low and dangerous, in a way Wren had never once heard from him before. There are 30 other SEALs less than 200 yards from this tent, Holt.
You think you're simply walking out of here? I think, Holt said, that everyone in this compound currently believes I'm the man trying to recover stolen hardware, not the man who arranged for it to be stolen in the first place. I think the Colonel trusts my clearance considerably more than he trusts a medic with a mysterious talent for 600-yard shots and a spotter carrying an 8-year-old grudge. And I think, Sergeant, that by the time either of you manages to convince a single soul of the truth, I'll already be 3 states away from here.
He turned toward the tent flap, then paused halfway through it, glancing back at Wren with something that almost resembled respect, twisted into a shape she never wanted to see directed at her again.
Your father would have been proud of that shot today, he said, genuinely. He always said you had better hands than half the operators he ever trained in 22 years. Don't, Wren said, her voice breaking on the single word, talk about my father. Holt didn't answer her. He simply stepped out into the morning light, and by the time Ashford reached the tent entrance 3 seconds later, the man had already vanished into the chaos of the compound. One more figure among dozens, moving through the aftermath of an ambush nobody yet understood was still actively unfolding around them. The Colonel arrived at the security tent less than 90 seconds after Holt vanished into the compound, summoned by a corporal who'd overheard enough of the confrontation through the canvas wall to understand something had gone badly wrong. He took one look at Wren's face, then at Ashford's, then at the personnel record still glowing on the terminal screen, and whatever skepticism he'd carried into the tent evaporated almost immediately. Start from the beginning, he said. All of it. I don't care how it sounds. Wren told him. The classified program, the 2 years of training that no longer existed on any official record, her father's death, and the signature that connected it to a man now walking freely through a compound full of soldiers who had no idea what he'd actually done. She left out nothing because there was no longer any version of this story where leaving something out protected anyone. The Colonel listened without interrupting, his jaw working once or twice, the particular stillness of a career officer absorbing information that would reshape every decision he made for the rest of the day. If this is true, he said finally, Holt just orchestrated an attack on 32 of my men to cover the theft of technology he arranged to have stolen. I want him detained. Now. He's already gone, Colonel, Ashford said. Walked straight out of this tent while we were confirming what we already suspected. Then find him. The Colonel's voice hardened into something Wren recognized instantly, the particular fury of a commander who'd just realized his own compound had been used against the people under his protection. I want base security combing every vehicle leaving this installation. I want Pruitt's flight logs pulled immediately, and I want to know exactly who authorized his reassignment this morning. I can save you the time on that last part, Wren said.
It'll trace back to Meridian's liaison channel, same one that grounded our air support an hour ago.
The colonel's expression darkened further. You're telling me a defense contractor just used my own base's communication infrastructure to ground my aircraft and murder 2 of my SEALs? I'm telling you, Holtz had 8 years to build the access he needed to do exactly that, Wren said. And he's not finished yet. Not until he's off this continent, or dead, or in front of a review board explaining every single decision he's made since my father found out what he was really doing. The colonel's radio crackled with a different kind of urgency less than 4 minutes later, and Ashford's face changed the instant he registered the transmission. Say again, Talon 1, he said into his own handset. Static answered first, then a voice oddly slow and careful for the gravity of the moment. Talon 1, reporting equipment fault, grounded for maintenance review, unable to provide air support at this time. Wren's head snapped up. That bird was fueled and running an hour ago. I watched the air crew run their pre-flight myself. Ashford keyed the radio again, jaw tight with something new, now something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a mounting, sickening realization. Talon 1, say status of your assigned pilot. A pause stretched a full beat too long before the answer finally came through. Pilot's been reassigned this morning, Sergeant. Orders processed through the Meridian liaison channel. Wren's stomach dropped for the second time that hour. Pruitt. Ashford looked at her sharply. You know that pilot? I clocked him yesterday morning during pre-flight checks. Chief Warrant Officer Danny Pruitt. She was already moving toward the vehicle bay as she spoke, piecing it together out loud faster than she could fully process it. Somebody reassigned our only air support less than an hour after Holt's ambush started, using the exact liaison channel that runs straight through Meridian. That's not maintenance. That's a man who was told in advance not to be anywhere near this compound once the shooting started. You think Pruitt's part of this? I think whoever built this ambush planned the exit route before either of us even knew there was a race to run. She climbed into the passenger seat, already reaching for the radio herself. Which means Holt isn't just fleeing blind. Somebody grounded our only chance at catching him from the air, and that somebody had access to flight orders. Ashford slid behind the wheel, expression hard as granite. Then we don't wait around for a bird that was never coming in the first place. No, Wren said, checking the rifle across her lap with hands that had finally, mercifully stopped shaking. We drive, and we beat him there ourselves. Reese swung into the back seat before either of them could tell him not to, rifle already slung tight across his chest, breathing hard from the sprint across the compound. Nobody invited you, Ashford said, throwing the vehicle into gear. Nobody invited an ambush either, Reese shot back, but here we all are anyway. This isn't your op, son. 2 of my men are dead and a third's in a medical tent right now. It's exactly my op. Wren didn't argue the point. She needed the extra rifle more than she needed to win that particular disagreement, and something in the set of Reese's jaw told her he'd more than earned the right to be sitting in that seat, regardless of what protocol said about it. The vehicle lurched forward, gravel spraying out behind them in a wide arc, and the compound blurred past the windows as Ashford pushed the truck toward the dry wash that cut through the eastern ridge, the one path that might still get them to Coldwater Airfield before Holt's head start ran out the clock entirely. Behind them, the command tent shrank into the dust, carrying with it a truth that had waited 8 patient years to finally come looking for the one person who'd never once stopped searching for it in return. As the compound disappeared behind a rise, Wren allowed herself for just a moment to look back at what remained of the morning. Medics moving between the wounded, a body bag being zipped closed near the northern wall, too slowly, too carefully, the particular reverence soldiers reserved for their own dead. 2 men lost to a plan that had been years in the making, set in motion the instant Meridian Defense decided her father's silence was worth more than his life. She turned back around and did not look again. Because grief, she'd learned a long time ago, was a debt that came due eventually no matter how long a person managed to defer the payment, and she intended to make sure the men responsible paid their own share of it first. The dry wash road cut southeast in long, punishing switches, and Ashford drove it the way her father used to drive terrain like this, fast enough to matter, careful enough to survive it.
the particular balance of a man who understood exactly how much risk a vehicle could absorb before it stopped being risk and became simple recklessness.
Reese braced himself against the doorframe in the back seat, watching the desert blur past in streaks of rust and gold.
You want to explain what just happened back there in plain terms without the shorthand? Because from where I was standing a minute ago, a defense contractor just confessed to murder in front of 3 witnesses and then walked away like he owned the place outright.
He does own the place, in every way that matters, or at least he did until about 10 minutes ago, Wren said, checking the rifle's action out of long habit, her hands steady now in a way they simply hadn't been capable of being an hour earlier. Now he's just a man running out of road, same as any other man who's finally been caught. And the guy who signed off on grounding our air support. Same man, different uniform. She glanced back at him. You asked earlier how a medic makes a 600-yard shot. I think you've mostly figured out the answer by now. I have a working theory, Reese said. Doesn't make it any less strange to hear out loud. Welcome to my whole life for the last 2 years. Ashford's knuckles had gone pale on the wheel, the particular tension of a man replaying 8 years of assumptions and watching every single one of them collapse in real time. I should have caught this, he said, mostly to himself. I was his spotter's replacement. I should have looked harder at who signed that report. You were grieving, Wren said. Same as me. Grief doesn't leave room for suspicion, not at first. It took me 2 years and a stolen file to start asking the right questions. You don't get to carry guilt for not doing what took me that long to manage myself. Doesn't make the 8 years feel any shorter, though. Not one bit of it. No, she agreed quietly, watching the desert scroll past. It never does. Grief doesn't run on anyone's calendar but its own. The truck hit a washboard section of rock, and all 3 of them braced against the impact, gear rattling in the back seat, the rifle case sliding half an inch before Reese caught it with his boot. There's exactly one paved route out of this basin, Ashford said, eyes back on the terrain ahead. Coldwater Airfield's the only strip within range that could handle a private aircraft. If Holt's smart, and he clearly is, that's where he's headed. And if he's already got a plane fueled and waiting, then we'd better hope this truck's faster than it looks. The desert opened up ahead of them in long, empty stretches, heat shimmering off the cracked earth in waves that made the horizon look like it was breathing, and somewhere beyond that horizon, a man who'd spent 8 years covering his own crimes was about to discover that the daughter he'd once called talented had never once stopped coming for the truth. Wren watched the mile markers count down through the windshield, each one bringing them closer to an airfield she'd never seen and a reckoning 8 years in the making. She thought briefly of her mother's voice on the landline, the promise she'd already broken without meaning to. She thought of her father's photograph, folded in the floorboard back at the cabin, waiting for her the way it always waited, patient and silent, and utterly unaware that the daughter it belonged to was 30 minutes from finally understanding how he'd actually died. She breathed out halfway the way she always did when the stakes stopped being theoretical and let the stillness settle into her hands one final time before whatever came next demanded everything she had left to give it. Beside her, Ashford drove in silence, and behind them both, Reese kept his eyes on the road ahead, the 3 of them, bound together now by something none of them had chosen. An ambush, 8 years in the making, finally closing the last mile of distance between a daughter and the truth she'd never once stopped needing. Whatever waited at Coldwater Airfield, Wren understood would not simply answer questions. It would demand a reckoning, one her father never lived to see, and one she intended finally to finish in his place. The truck pushed on through the last stretch of open desert, dust rising behind it in a long gray trail, carrying 3 people toward an ending none of them could fully picture yet, and a truth that had waited 8 patient years for exactly this morning to finally come due. None of them spoke again until the terrain began to change beneath the tires, the wash finally giving way to the harder-packed earth that meant Coldwater Airfield sat somewhere just beyond the next rise, waiting, along with everything else the morning still had left to give.
Wren checked the rifle one last time, settled it across her lap, and watched the horizon for the first glint of a runway that would decide, one way or another, whether 8 years of silence finally ended in answers or in something far worse than silence had ever been.
The colonel bought them roughly 11 minutes before the base fully understood what had happened. 11 minutes of confusion and shouted questions that Ashford spent arguing jurisdiction and classified protocols into a radio, while Wren loaded a spare rifle case into the back of a stripped-down pursuit vehicle, with hands that finally, blessedly, had stopped shaking. 11 minutes was nothing. And 11 minutes, if you used every second of it right, was also somehow everything.
Holt's got a 20-minute head start on the road, Ashford said, sliding behind the wheel. There's exactly one paved route out of this basin a civilian vehicle can manage without four-wheel drive. He's not flying out, not with Pruitt's bird grounded. Nearest working strip is Coldwater Airfield, 40 minutes east by the main road.
Then we don't chase him down that road, Wren said, already buckling in. We beat him there, through the wash.
That cuts through terrain that eats transmissions for breakfast.
Then we'd better hope this one's hungry for something else today.
Ashford almost smiled at that, the ghost of an old, tired grin. Your father drove that exact wash in a 2-ton truck during a sandstorm once.
Guess some things run in the family whether a person wants them to or not.
Guess they do.
The vehicle lurched forward, gravel spraying out behind them in a wide gray arc, and Wren gripped the door handle while the compound blurred past the window in streaks of khaki and dust. Reese jogged alongside for 3 full strides before swinging himself into the back seat, breathless, rifle already slung tight across his chest.
Nobody invited you,
Ashford said again, for form's sake more than actual objection. Nobody invited an ambush either, Reese said, but here we are. The wash opened up ahead of them minutes later, a pale scar of rock cutting through red earth, and Ashford pushed the truck into it at a speed that made Wren's stomach lift somewhere up near her throat and stay there.
Talk to me,
Reese said, bracing hard against the seat as the vehicle bounced over a rock shelf that nearly took the front axle with it.
Who exactly are we chasing, and why does a contract medic shoot like a ghost story people tell around a campfire? Because there wasn't time left to soften any of it. Because 8 years of silence had already cost far too much, and 1 more hour of it might end up costing everything else she had left.
My name isn't just Calloway, to keep things simple, she said, the words coming faster now, unraveling like thread pulled off a spool wound too tight for too many years. It's my father's name. Gunnery Sergeant Emmett Calloway, Force Recon. Killed 8 years ago in what everybody still calls a training accident. Calloway? Reese's eyes widened slightly. The Calloway?
The one they still talk about down at Pendleton like he invented the whole discipline himself.
That one. And you? I was recruited into a classified program 2 years after he died. Female operators, sniper specialization, small footprint, fully deniable if anything ever went wrong in the field. She stared straight ahead through the windshield, the desert rushing past in streaks of gold and rust and heat.
They called us Ghost. I was 6. The whole program got shut down 2 years ago after I found evidence connecting a contractor named Meridian to financial fraud running through the operation. I got flagged as killed in action to make my paper trail disappear cleanly.
You're not dead.
According to the Marine Corps, I've been dead for 2 years. Reese sat back against the seat, processing that in the particular silence of a man recalculating everything he thought he'd understood about the small, quiet medic who'd been handing out gauze and reassurance 3 days earlier.
And Holt, he finally said, signed the report on my father's death 8 years ago. Same handwriting on both files, 8 years apart. Her voice cracked just slightly on the word father, and she hated that it cracked. Hated that 8 years of discipline still couldn't fully armor her against the particular sound of her own grief breaking through. He's not just Meridian's program director. He's been running 2 identities for 8 straight years. Military liaison, civilian executive, both of them the same man, covering for himself in 2 directions at once. That's not something one man builds alone, Ashford said, eyes locked on the terrain ahead, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. Holt's smart, but he's not that smart. Somebody with real institutional authority has been protecting him this entire time, long before any of us got dragged into this. Who? Reese asked. I don't know yet, Wren admitted. But my father was Marcus Vane's spotter's predecessor once too, back before Cole took over the role. If anyone from that era might know who's actually been protecting Holt all these years, it's him. Assuming he's even still reachable. Last I heard, he retired to Montana and mostly disappeared. The truck crested a rise and Coldwater Airfield came into view below them, a single cracked runway carved out of scrubland with 2 hangars and a windsock hanging limp in the still morning air, like it had given up predicting anything about this day. And parked beside the smaller hangar, engine-running rotors already beginning their slow, ominous spin-up, sat a private helicopter, carrying Meridian defense markings across its tail. He's not driving anywhere from here, Wren said. He's flying out. Then we're out of road and nearly out of time, Ashford said, already pushing the accelerator down toward the airfield's perimeter fence. They came through a gap in the northern fence line, tires skidding hard across loose gravel, and Wren was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped moving, rifle up, dropping into the low crouch her father had drilled into her before she'd finished growing into her own adult body. The helicopter's rotors churned faster now, kicking up a storm of dust and grit that stung her eyes and swallowed every other sound whole. A figure emerged from the smaller hangar, tall, silver-haired, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd survived worse mornings than this one and expected to survive plenty more. Except it wasn't Holt. It was someone else entirely, someone whose face struck Wren with a force that stole the air clean out of her lungs before her mind had fully finished placing the memory attached to it. Because she knew that face. She'd known it since childhood, from photographs propped on her father's desk, from stories told around campfires during the rare weekends he actually made it home, from a name spoken with a reverence that had once made an 8-year-old girl believe the man behind it could walk on water if he set his mind to it.
Uncle Marcus,
She whispered, the words escaping before she could stop a single one of them. Colonel Marcus Vane turned toward the sound of her voice, and whatever composure remained on his weathered face cracked open at the sight of her just for a moment. Just long enough for Wren to see something underneath the mask that looked uncomfortably close to grief. Wren. Her name in his mouth sounded like an apology and a confession folded together into one word. You weren't supposed to be here. Not today. Not ever again, honestly, if I'd had my way about any of it. You're supposed to be retired, she said, her voice shaking now, the rifle heavy and uncertain in hands that had never once wavered on a real target before this exact moment. You're supposed to be up in Montana, fishing, sending me a Christmas card every single year that I never open because I can't stand looking at your handwriting on the envelope and thinking about my father in the same breath. I know. Do you? Because right now you're standing next to Grady Holt's helicopter at the exact airfield he's running to on the exact morning his ambush killed 2 SEALs and very nearly killed 30 more of them. Vane's jaw worked once, silently. The look of a man watching his own excuses finally run clean out of road to hide behind. Behind him in the hangar doorway, Holt appeared, freezing at the sight of the standoff already unfolding in front of him. You don't understand what you've stumbled into, Vane said. This is bigger than Meridian, bigger than one contract, one program, one ambush. There are people well above Holt who killed my father, Wren finished for him. That's the part you're carefully avoiding saying out loud, isn't it? Because you were there. You were his spotter for 11 years before Ashford ever took over the role. You knew exactly what he'd found in that file, and you let Holt kill him for it anyway. The silence that followed felt like the entire desert had simply stopped breathing around them. I didn't let anything happen, Vane said, his voice low, ragged at the edges, in a way she'd never once heard from him growing up. I tried to stop it. I failed. And I've spent 8 years since trying to bury what happened deep enough that nobody would ever have to know your father died because of 30 pieces of silver dressed up in a defense contract's clothing. Then why are you here, right now, helping him get away? Because if Holt talks, Wren, he takes down half the oversight committee that approved Crosshair's funding along with him. Generals, contractors, names that would headline the evening news for the better part of a decade. Vane's hands trembled at his sides, an old man's hands now, weathered by a guilt he'd clearly never once managed to set down in 8 long years of trying. I'm not helping him escape. I came here to make certain he doesn't disappear before he finally answers for what he did to your father and to you. That's not your call to make. No, Vane admitted quietly. It never should have been. It should have been yours from the very beginning. You spent 11 years as his spotter, Wren said, the accusation cutting sharper now, the particular fury of someone who'd spent 8 years grieving a man this stranger might have saved. You knew him better than almost anyone alive. You knew how he thought, how he moved, what he'd do the second he found something wrong in those requisition numbers. And when the moment came, you stood by and let Holt silence him instead of standing beside him. I tried to talk him out of reporting it, Vane said, his voice cracking now, the particular sound of a man finally saying words he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in his own head and never once had the courage to speak aloud. I told him to let it go. Told him some fights weren't worth what they'd cost. He looked at me the way he used to look at recruits who suggested cutting corners on a stalk, like I'd disappointed him more than he had words for. He told me some things were worth the cost precisely because of what they cost. I've heard that sentence in my head every single night for 8 years. And you did nothing. I threatened Holt, told him if anything happened to Emmett, I'd bury him myself. He smiled at me the way he's been smiling at everyone since, like a man who already knew exactly how the story would end, regardless of what anyone threatened him with. Vane's hands trembled harder now, the tremor spreading up through his forearms. 3 weeks later, your father was dead, and I stood at his funeral in dress blues, and I carried a flag box I had no right to touch, and I told myself the lie that staying quiet was somehow protecting you and your mother both. I've told myself that lie every single day since Wren, and I don't think I believed it for even one of them. He glanced past her toward Ashford and Reese taking up positions along the fence line, then back to her, something almost pleading entering his voice for the first time since she'd found him standing there. I've spent 8 years telling myself that silence was mercy, that the fewer people who knew the truth, the fewer people it would destroy on its way out. I told myself that every Christmas I signed a card I knew you'd never open. I told myself that every time I thought about picking up a phone and calling you instead. I was wrong, Wren. I've been wrong the entire time, and I only understood how wrong 3 weeks ago when Holt told me he intended to disappear with this hardware for good and leave the rest of us holding the truth like it was a live grenade. So you came here to stop him. I came here to make sure he didn't disappear with the only proof I've spent 2 years quietly assembling. Whatever happens to me after that, I decided I could live with. I've had 8 years to get comfortable with the idea that I don't deserve much more than that. Behind him, Holt moved. Fast, sudden, the kind of movement that only came from a man who understood this exact conversation had already run past the point where he could survive it cleanly. He lunged for a weapon resting just inside the hangar doorway, and the whole world narrowed into the single, terrible clarity Wren's entire body had been built for since she was 18 years old on a desert range, with her father standing behind her shoulder. "Gun!" Reese shouted, already diving for cover behind the truck's open door. Wren's training took over, a half step ahead of conscious thought. She dropped into a crouch, rifle rising, breath already halfway out of her lungs in the exact rhythm her father had carved into her bones long before she understood what any of it would eventually cost her. Holt fired first. The round tore through the air inches from her shoulder, close enough that she felt the heat of its passing brush across her skin. She didn't fire back, not yet, because Vane stood directly in her line of sight, frozen in the exact space between her and Holt, an old man caught in the precise place where guilt and duty had finally, after 8 long years, collided head-on. "Marcus, move!" Ashford screamed. Vane didn't move. Instead, in the space of a single impossible heartbeat, he turned and lunged toward Holt, grabbing for the weapon with the desperate strength of a man trying to buy back 8 entire years of cowardice in one final irreversible act. The gun went off between them. Vane crumpled first, a dark stain spreading fast across his shirt, and Holt staggered backward into the hangar doorway with a wound of his own blooming red across his ribs, the two men collapsing together in a tangle that looked, for one horrifying second, almost like an embrace neither of them had ever managed while standing upright.
No!
Wren was moving before she'd even registered the decision to move, rifle falling from her hands into the dirt, sprinting across open ground toward two men who'd both in their own broken and complicated ways shaped the entire trajectory of her life, without her ever fully understanding how much until this exact moment. Vane's eyes found hers as she dropped to her knees beside him, blood already pooling beneath his shoulders in the pale dirt.
Your father,
he said, each word costing him visibly more than the last,
used to say the shot lives in the stillness. After the exhale, not before it. Don't talk, save your strength. I'm not going to make it, Wren. I know the difference between the two, believe me.
His hand found hers, weak, trembling, blood-slicked and cold already.
I should have stopped this 8 years ago. I should have told you the truth the day it happened instead of hiding behind a folded flag and a report I knew from the very first line was a lie. Then tell me now. All of it. Holt didn't act alone, not once in any of this. There's a name. A committee chair who authorized the black funding behind Crosshair, who knew exactly what happened to your father and signed off on the cover story anyway without blinking. His breathing turned shallow, uneven, each word slower than the one before it. It's in my truck, glove compartment, a drive with everything I've spent 2 years quietly collecting, trying to build a case I never once found the courage to actually use while I was still standing. Why didn't you use it sooner? Because using it meant admitting what I'd let happen. Meant admitting I'd chosen a career and a pension and the quiet comfort of pretending over the one thing that actually mattered, which was you, and the truth you deserved from the very first day. His grip weakened further, his voice dropping to something close to a whisper now. I told myself I was protecting you by staying silent. I understand now that I was only ever protecting myself. I forgive you. Wren said the words, tearing out of her before she fully understood whether they were true yet, because some truths only became real in the actual saying of them out loud. I forgive you, Uncle Marcus. Just stay with me, please. Tell your mother, he managed, barely audible now, that I'm sorry. For every card, every single one. She'll know what I mean. His hand went slack in hers 3 seconds later. Behind her, Holt groaned against the hangar wall, alive, wounded, his own weapon lying several feet beyond his reach where it had skittered during the struggle. Reese reached him first, kicking the gun further away with his boot, pressing a knee hard into Holt's chest with the particular fury of a man who'd watched 2 brothers die that same morning and wasn't finished being angry about it. Don't, Wren said, her voice cutting through the moment before Reese's fury could curdle into something neither of them would be able to undo afterward. We need him alive. We need him to talk on record, in front of people who can actually do something with what he says. Reese looked at her chest, still heaving, and slowly, reluctantly eased his weight back. He deserves a great deal worse than staying alive. He does, Wren agreed quietly. But dead men don't testify in front of a review board, and I need this on the record more than I need him to suffer for it. She rose from beside Vane's body, legs unsteady beneath her, and looked down at Holt for a long moment, blood soaking through his shirt. His breathing labored but steady enough that she knew, with the particular certainty of someone who'd stitched 1,000 wounds, that he'd survive to face exactly what was coming for him. You should have stopped when my father gave you the chance, she said. You had every opportunity in the world to walk away, and you chose this instead. Now you get to live long enough to watch it all come apart around you. Holt didn't answer. There was nothing left in his face that resembled the smooth, rehearsed confidence he'd carried into every conversation since she'd arrived at Fort Ridgeline, only the particular hollow exhaustion of a man who understood, finally, that the story had ended in exactly the place he'd spent 8 years trying to prevent.
The drive Vane had mentioned sat exactly where he said it would, tucked into a hidden compartment behind the glove box of his truck. And what it contained unraveled over the following weeks into something far larger than a single ambush at a single training exercise. Financial records connecting 3 separate black-budget programs to a shell network of contractors, all funneling money through Meridian Defense with the quiet blessing of a single oversight committee chair whose name Wren recognized instantly from a photograph she'd walked past 100 times on a hallway wall without ever really seeing it for what it was. Congressional hearings followed, quiet ones at first, held behind closed doors, then progressively louder ones until the full story finally broke into public record 8 months after the ambush at Fort Ridgeline. Holt survived his wound, stood trial, and in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirmed under oath every single thing Vane's drive had already proven on its own. Chief Warrant Officer Danny Pruitt turned out to have known considerably less than Wren initially suspected, a fact that surprised her more than it probably should have. He'd taken the reassignment order at face value, the way any pilot might, never once questioning a liaison channel he'd trusted for years. And when investigators finally sat him down, his account matched every timestamp and every transmission exactly. He hadn't been part of the conspiracy. He'd simply been a tool, used by someone who understood precisely which levers moved without resistance inside a system built on trust between uniforms.
He testified without hesitation once he understood what his own compliance had nearly cost, and the review board ultimately cleared him of any wrongdoing, though Wren noticed the one time their paths crossed again, months later, at a logistics hearing, that he still carried the particular weight of a man who couldn't quite forgive himself for not asking more questions when it mattered. The Oversight Committee chair, whose signature appeared throughout Vane's recovered files, resigned within a week of the story breaking quietly without a public statement beyond 2 sentences released through a spokesperson. 2 more names surfaced in the months that followed, contractors and a retired general whose approval signatures had authorized funding streams that should never have existed in the first place. None of it moved as fast as Wren wanted it to. All of it eventually moved. The murder of Gunnery Sergeant Emmett Calloway, the systematic erasure of a classified training program, and the one medic who'd once been its finest graduate. The ambush designed to steal Crosshair prototype technology and sell it through a private buyer before Meridian's own board could discover the fraud, quietly eating through their black-budget contracts from the inside out. But none of that unfolded in a single afternoon, however it might have looked from the outside. What happened in that single afternoon, the part that mattered most to Wren personally, unfolded 3 hours after the shooting finally stopped in a hastily assembled medical tent at Coldwater Airfield, while emergency responders arrived at last from the nearest town, siren lights washing red and blue across a runway that had nearly seen a very different kind of ending. Wren sat on the edge of a gurney. A graze wound along her upper arm, finally getting the attention she'd flatly refused to give it, while Vane bled out in her arms, and Holt screamed for a medic he didn't remotely deserve to have tending him. A young paramedic knelt in front of her, running through standard intake questions with the practiced, unhurried rhythm of someone who'd done exactly this 1,000 times before without incident.
Name? Wren Calloway. Date of birth? She gave it automatically. Exhausted, her eyes fixed somewhere past his shoulder on the wreckage of the morning, still smoking gently behind him. The paramedic typed the information into a handheld device, waiting for the system to pull her medical history, and Wren watched his face change in real time as the screen returned something he clearly hadn't expected to see.
"Ma'am," he said slowly, "the system's flagging your identity as deceased. Killed in action 2 years ago. I'm going to need you to confirm your identity again because this doesn't match what's showing on my end at all."
Ashford, standing at the tent entrance with blood still drying on his sleeve from carrying wounded across the airfield, stepped forward before Wren could even open her mouth to answer.
"She's not dead," he said, his voice carrying the particular authority of 30 years spent giving orders that people actually listened to.
"That flag is a classified program error above your clearance to resolve on your own. I'll walk you through the correction protocol personally right now before this goes any further." "Sir, I can't just override a federal—"
"You're about to," Ashford said, because in roughly 4 minutes, half of Naval Special Warfare Command is going to descend on this airfield asking exactly who shot a suppressed target from 600 yards this morning and saved 31 lives doing it. And I'd much rather they find a living hero standing here than a paperwork error waiting to be explained. The paramedic looked between them uncertain until Reese stepped into the tent behind Ashford, his uniform still torn from the morning's chaos, his expression carrying a weight that hadn't been there 3 days earlier when he'd called her small woman with the sharp mouth. "Her name is Wren Calloway," he said. "She's Ghost 6, and she just saved every single one of us out there today." Word spread through the recovering unit faster than any official statement ever could have managed on its own. By the time the base commander arrived to survey the wreckage of what should have been a routine training exercise, every SEAL who'd walked away alive that morning already knew the name of the woman who'd made the impossible shot from the ridge, and every one of them understood exactly what she'd sacrificed to become invisible enough to be standing there and save them in the first place. Morales found her before she left the airfield that evening, his arm in a fresh sling, his color mostly returned. "Wanted to say thank you properly," he said, "before you disappeared back into whatever mountain you crawled out of. You'd have made it without me. Maybe. Wouldn't have wanted to test that theory, though." He extended his good hand and she shook it, something in his grip carrying more gratitude than either of them had words for. "Whatever they end up calling you officially, far as I'm concerned, you're the reason I get to go home." She didn't have an answer for that either, not one that wouldn't have broken something in her voice, so she simply nodded and let the moment stand on its own, the way the best ones usually did. The reinstatement hearing took place 4 months later, in a windowless room at the Pentagon that felt to Wren entirely too small for the weight of everything being decided inside it. She sat across from a review board of 5 officers, none of whom she recognized personally, all of whom had clearly read a file 2 years thick documenting a program erased so thoroughly that until recently, no official record anywhere acknowledged it had ever existed in the first place. "Ms. Calloway," the presiding officer said, an older woman with silver hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked almost painful to maintain. "The board has reviewed the full account of your actions at Fort Ridgeline, cross-referenced against the classified files recovered during Colonel Vane's posthumous investigation. We've also reviewed your father's complete service record, including the corrected findings regarding the true circumstances of his death." Wren's hands folded tightly in her lap. "Yes, ma'am. It's the board's unanimous recommendation that your status be formally restored, retroactive to the date of your original commission into the classified operator program. Additionally, your father's service record will be amended to reflect the true circumstances surrounding his death, and a formal commendation will be issued posthumously for the intelligence he uncovered regarding fraud within defense contracting oversight at real personal cost to himself and his family." The words settled over her slowly, each one landing like a stone dropped into perfectly still water, ripples spreading outward through 8 years of grief she'd carried entirely alone up on that mountain. "Thank you," she managed, though the phrase felt impossibly small for everything it was being asked to hold. "Don't thank us yet," the officer said, something almost gentle entering her voice for the first time since the hearing began. "We're also formally offering you a position. Not the shadow program you originally graduated from, something different this time. A training command, developing the next generation of operators using exactly the skills your father spent his entire career refining, and that you've spent the last 8 years proving out in the field, regardless of whether the paperwork ever acknowledged your existence." Wren felt something crack open in her chest, not grief this time, something closer to the particular ache of finally being fully seen, for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I'd need some time to think it over," she said. "Take whatever time you need, Miss Calloway. You've more than earned it." She lingered in the hallway outside the review room longer than she needed to afterward, watching officers and aides move past her in both directions, none of them aware that the small woman standing quietly against the wall had just been handed back an identity the government spent 2 years insisting never existed. Ashford found her there waiting, the way he always seemed to know when to wait, saying nothing until she was ready to speak first.
They offered me a training command, she said finally. I heard. Word travels fast in a building this size. I don't know if I'm ready for that, teaching other people to do what my father taught me. What if I get it wrong? What if someone I train ends up standing on a ridge somewhere with no one left to vouch for who they really are, same as I did? Then you'll be the one standing beside them who already knows exactly what that costs, Ashford said. That's not a liability, Wren. That's the entire point of you taking the job in the first place.
She considered that a long moment, the hallway noise washing past them both. Career officers moving through their ordinary Tuesday with no idea how close the whole apparatus above them had come to protecting a murderer instead of exposing him. My father used to say, experience only matters if you're willing to hand it off eventually, she said. Otherwise, it just dies with you, and the next person has to learn everything the same hard way you did.
Sounds like a man who already knew what you'd end up doing with your life long before either of you understood how you'd get there.
Maybe he did. She managed something close to a smile, small tentative, the first hint of the shape her face would eventually settle back into once enough time passed. I think I'm going to take the job, Cole. I think that's the first decision you've made in 8 years that didn't have grief holding the pen. Don't get sentimental on me, Sergeant. We've still got Holt's trial to sit through before any of this actually starts. Copy that, he said. And for the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember, something in his voice sounded almost like relief. She stood at her father's grave 3 weeks later, on a hillside overlooking the Pacific where he'd asked to be buried long before anyone imagined he'd need the arrangement so soon. The headstone had been replaced the previous month, the language finally corrected, finally honest, finally telling the truth about a man who'd died protecting something larger than himself, instead of a lie constructed specifically to protect the people who'd killed him. Gunnery Sergeant Emmett Calloway, beloved father, devoted Marine. He uncovered the truth and paid the ultimate price for it. Her mother stood on her other side, a hand resting light on Wren's shoulder, the two of them quiet together in a way that 8 years of shared grief had made almost comfortable. Marcus asked me to tell you something, Wren said eventually. Before he died, said to tell you he was sorry for every card, every single one. Said you'd know what he meant. Eleanor Calloway's eyes closed briefly, something passing behind them that looked like the release of a weight she'd carried quietly for longer than she'd ever admitted out loud. I always suspected he knew more than he let on, she said. Your father trusted him completely right up until the day he died. I think some part of Marcus never forgave himself for that trust. Do you forgive him? I forgave him a long time ago, sweetheart. Forgiveness was never the hard part. Living with the not knowing was the hard part. And now, at least, we don't have to live with that anymore. She was quiet a moment, watching the wind move through the grass the way it always did on this hillside, patient and indifferent, and somehow comforting in its indifference. I used to lie awake some nights, Eleanor continued, wondering if I'd married a man I only half knew. Wondering if the work he did overseas and the work he did stateside had hollowed something out of him that I never quite got to see. Then you'd come home from a weekend at the range with him, eyes lit up the way they used to get, telling me about wind readings and trigger discipline like they were the most fascinating subjects in the world, and I'd remember why I fell in love with him in the first place. He gave you something real, Wren. Whatever else happened, whatever this whole mess turned out to be, built on that part, was never a lie. I used to think loving what he taught me meant I loved the danger of it too, Wren said. Took me a long time to understand those were two different things. Are they different things, I mean? I think so. I don't love the danger, I never did. I love the precision, the idea that if you do everything exactly right, exactly the way he taught me, you can save someone instead of losing them. That's what I took from him. Not the war. The care underneath it. Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand, once firm grounding. Then that's exactly what you should build this training command around. Not turning young operators into weapons, turning them into people who understand precisely what all that precision is actually for. I'll think about that. You do that.
Eleanor glanced toward the car waiting at the bottom of the hill, toward the young man leaning against it, who clearly hadn't stopped watching Wren since she'd arrived.
And you'll think about him too, I imagine, whether you mean to or not. Mom, I'm simply making an observation. A mother's allowed that much, even at a graveside.
Wren didn't dignify that with a response, though something in her chest, some old and unfamiliar warmth, made the accusation harder to dismiss than she wanted to admit.
Ashford stood, a respectful distance away, quiet the way he'd learned to be quiet over 30 years of knowing exactly when words helped a moment and when they only got in the way of one.
"He'd be proud of you," he finally said once Eleanor had stepped away to place her own stone atop the grave. "Both of them would."
I know. And for the first time in 8 years, she actually believed it fully, the words settling into her chest without the familiar undertow of doubt trailing behind them like they always used to. I keep thinking about what he used to tell me, about the shot living in the stillness after the exhale. Yeah, I think that's what grief turns out to be too, she said, watching the wind move through the grass along the hillside, watching the ocean stretch out toward a horizon that finally, after 8 long years, looked like something other than an ending.
You breathe out. You brace for the pain to hit right there in that exact moment, the exhale, when everything feels most exposed and unguarded.
But it doesn't come then. It waits. It arrives after, in the stillness, right when you're finally still enough to let it land properly. Ashford didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice carried a rare, unguarded warmth she wasn't used to hearing from him.
"And after it lands?"
"After it lands," Wren said, kneeling to place a single smooth stone atop her father's headstone, an old ritual, older than her, older even than the wars that had shaped him, a small, quiet promise that someone out there still remembered. You're still standing, and I think that has to count for something real.
She stood brushing dirt from her knees and looked out toward the water one last long moment before turning back toward the car waiting at the bottom of the hill. Reese leaned against the hood, having driven up from Coronado that morning specifically for this, wearing civilian clothes for the first time since she'd met him 3 months earlier, looking somehow younger without the weight of command hanging visibly off his shoulders. "You gonna take the job?" he asked as she approached.
Training command, probably, yeah. She managed something close to a real smile, the first genuine one in longer than she could easily remember. Somebody's got to make sure the next generation doesn't have to disappear off the record just to matter to anyone. They'll be lucky to have you running things.
"They'll survive me at the very least. That's about all I can promise anybody at this point."
He laughed at that, a real laugh, and opened the car door for her with an exaggerated flourish that made her roll her eyes despite the small smile still tugging at the corner of her mouth. "For what it's worth," he added more seriously as she settled into the passenger seat, "Morales still talks about you at every unit function he goes to.
You've officially become a legend down at Coronado. Ghost 6, the medic who wasn't."
Tell him I said to stop exaggerating. Wouldn't dream of it. Man's earned his stories same as the rest of us. He walked around to the driver's side, then paused with his hand on the door, looking at her over the roof of the car in the fading light.
"You know," he said, "when this training command gets up and running, they're going to need experienced operators to help build the curriculum. People who've actually lived the work instead of just theorizing about it from behind a desk somewhere."
Are you angling for a job, petty officer?
Might be. Depends who's hiring.
I'll take it under advisement.
That's all I'm asking for. He climbed in beside her, started the engine, and let it idle a moment before pulling away from the curb. "For what it's worth, I meant what I said back at Coldwater. Whoever you really are, underneath all the layers you spent 8 years building around yourself, I'm glad I got to find out." You say that like the finding out part is over. Isn't it? "Not even close," she said, watching the cemetery gates slide past the window as the car pulled out onto the coastal road, the ocean stretching wide and gold beside them in the last hour of daylight.
I'm still finding out most of it myself. The road curved along the bluff for a while in comfortable silence, the kind two people only earn after surviving something together that neither of them fully expected to survive. Reese didn't push for more conversation, and she didn't offer any, content instead to watch the light change over the water, gold sliding slowly into the deeper orange of early evening.
My father used to say the ocean was the only thing patient enough to outlast grief, she said, eventually, more to the window than to him. I never understood what he meant until today.
What do you think he meant? That grief eventually runs out of new ways to hurt you? The ocean never runs out of anything. It just keeps coming back the same and different every single time until eventually you stop bracing for it and start simply watching it instead. Reese glanced over at her, something quiet and unguarded in his expression. Sounds like a decent way to live, if a person could manage it. Ask me again in a year, she said. I'll let you know if I've managed it. Because 8 years of silence had finally, completely broken. Because the truth, once buried so deep it had nearly disappeared for good, had clawed its way back into the light exactly the way her father always believed the truth eventually did, given enough time, given enough people still willing to keep asking hard questions, long after every incentive pointed toward staying quiet instead. And because somewhere in the space between grief and vindication, in the stillness after an exhale that had lasted 8 impossibly long years, Wren Calloway had finally found the one thing she'd never quite let herself believe she deserved to have again. Peace. Not the absence of pain, never that, not entirely, not for someone who'd lost what she'd lost, but something steadier underneath it now. Something that let her stand on a hillside overlooking the ocean, remembering a father who'd taught her everything about precision and almost nothing about how to survive losing him, and still, somehow, after everything, feel whole standing there. The car pulled away from the cemetery as the sun dropped low over the water, casting long gold light across a hillside that finally held a truth strong enough to last as long as it needed to. Ghost 6 was retired now, for good this time, by her own choice rather than someone else's erasure. But her father's daughter, the woman he'd built out of patience and precision and 8 years of unbearable, unfinished love, was only just beginning.